Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you powerful tales of love, courage, and justice. Today, we share the heart-wrenching journey of a father who discovers his young daughter's silent suffering at school. When his daughter Emma begins to show signs of fear and distress, he embarks on a quest to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. This story is one of determination, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his child. Stay with us as we dive into this emotional journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. I remember the moment like it was yesterday. It was a chilly morning. The kind where the frost clings to the edges of the windows and the world outside seems silent and still. I stood by the door, helping Emma, my 7-year-old daughter, tie her shoelaces. The same routine we'd done for years. Yet, this time, something felt different. Emma, usually so eager to start her day, was unusually quiet. She didn't seem to notice the cold wind nipping at her cheeks or the way the sun was slowly creeping over the horizon. Her small hands, instead of bouncing with energy, clutched the hem of her shirt tightly, her knuckles white with tension. I looked at her face. Her dark brown eyes that usually sparkled with curiosity. Today, they were dull, shadowed by an invisible fear I couldn't quite place. I knelt down to meet her gaze, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, trying to hide the unease in my own heart. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" I asked softly, keeping my voice steady. She didn't respond. Her lips trembled slightly, and a single tear slid down her cheek. It broke my heart. I wiped it away with my thumb. But she pulled back, her eyes avoiding mine. "Emma, what's wrong?" I asked again, my voice growing more concerned. She sniffled, pulling herself closer to me, as if she sought comfort in my presence. "Daddy, can I stay home today?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. My heart sank. Emma had never asked to skip school. She loved it, or at least she used to. "Are you feeling sick?" I asked, my brow furrowing. "Did something happen at school?" She shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the floor. "No, Daddy, I just don't want to go," she said, her words heavy with an emotion I couldn't decipher. I crouched down, bringing myself to her eye level, my hands gently holding her trembling ones. "Emma, you can tell me anything. You know that, right?" I looked into her eyes, searching for a sign that she would let me in. But she just shook her head again. "I'll go to school. Daddy, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. A tear slipped down her cheek, and I saw her wipe it away quickly, as though trying to hide it from me. She clutched her shirt tighter, as though she were trying to hold herself together. I didn't push her anymore. Something in her eyes told me she wasn't ready to speak. But my worry, my gut feeling that something wasn't right, gnawed at me as I drove her to school that day. She didn't talk in the car, her eyes staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts. The usual chatter about her friends, her favorite toys, the things she loved to talk about, none of it came. She just stared, her face pale, her body stiff with anxiety. When we arrived at the school, I parked the car and turned to her, my heart aching. "Are you sure you don't want to talk about it? You know you can tell me anything, right?" I asked again, desperately hoping for an answer. She looked at me for a moment, her small face set in a strange expression. And then, for a brief second, she spoke. "Daddy, if I'm not a good girl, will you still love me?" The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. I reached out, pulling her into a tight hug. "Emma," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "You are always my precious girl. I love you, no matter what. You don't ever have to worry about that." She buried her head in my chest, her tiny shoulders shaking with what I now realized was fear. "Daddy, I'm scared," she mumbled. I held her tighter, my own heart shattering as I felt her fear seep into me. "What are you scared of, my love?" I asked, my voice shaky, but she shook her head, refusing to speak anymore. Before I could press further, she pulled away from me, her eyes filled with a mix of terror and determination, and she ran towards the school gates. I watched her disappear into the school, my heart heavy with worry. The weight of her unspoken fears pressing down on me. Something was terribly wrong, but what could it be? I didn't have the answers yet. But I knew, deep down, that I had to find out. For her sake. As the day wore on, I couldn't focus. Thoughts of Emma, her pale face, and her silent suffering consumed me. What could have happened? What could be so terrible that she felt she couldn't share it with me? The hours passed slowly, each minute heavier than the last. I couldn't shake the image of Emma's tear-streaked face from my mind. Nor could I ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong at school. I knew I had to find out the truth, no matter what. But when I picked Emma up later that afternoon, my heart sank deeper. She walked out of the classroom, her small frame barely noticeable among the other children. But what struck me most was the expression on her face. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes swollen as though she had been crying for hours. And her steps were slow and heavy, like she was dragging herself along. "Sweetheart, come here," I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The moment she saw me, she ran, her tiny arms wrapping around my waist as if she were afraid to let go. I felt the tremble in her body, the weight of her fear. I held her tight, feeling her fragile form shaking in my arms. "What happened, honey? Tell me what's going on," I whispered, my voice barely holding together as I stroked her hair. She didn't respond. Instead, she buried her face in my chest, her body shuddering as silent sobs racked her tiny frame. The knot in my stomach grew tighter. This wasn't normal. This wasn't my Emma. A voice behind me interrupted my thoughts. "Mr. Daniel," came a woman's voice, calm and measured, almost cold. I turned to see Mrs. Carter, Emma's teacher. Her appearance sent a chill through me. Her sharp eyes studied me like a predator watching its prey. And her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Mr. Daniel," she said with a cold politeness. "I wanted to speak to you about Emma." I forced myself to smile back. But it felt like my lips were made of stone. "What's going on? Is everything okay with her?" I asked, my tone more demanding than I intended. Mrs. Carter gave a small shrug, her eyes never leaving me. "Well, Emma seems to be a very sensitive child. She doesn't quite get along with the other kids. I think you should encourage her to toughen up." Her words were like ice. And my unease deepened. "Toughen up?" I repeated, my voice steady but firm. "Emma's a good girl. She's kind and gentle. I'm teaching her to be compassionate, not to harden her heart." Mrs. Carter's smile turned into something more menacing. "Of course, Mr. Daniel, but perhaps you should also teach her that the world isn't always kind. And that people will take advantage of her softness." Something about her words didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just her tone, it was her attitude. Her lack of care for Emma's well-being. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't trust her, but I couldn't explain why. Not yet. That night, as I washed the dishes, a soft sound broke through my thoughts. Emma's quiet sobs coming from her room. I rushed to her side, my heart hammering in my chest. She was sitting on her bed, hugging her teddy bear tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Emma," I said gently, sitting beside her and pulling her into my arms. "Did you have a bad dream?" She nodded silently, her face hidden against my chest. "I dreamed someone took me away, Daddy, and you couldn't find me anymore," she whispered through her tears. I tightened my grip on her. "I will never let anyone take you away. Sweetheart, I'll always protect you." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. "If I tell anyone, they'll take you away," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Then I'd never see you again." My heart froze. Who had told her that? "Who told you that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "No one," she mumbled, her eyes darting away from mine, as if she couldn't bear to face me. Something clicked in my mind then. I didn't know what was happening yet, but I could feel it in my gut. Emma was hiding something. Something terrible, and I had to find out what it was. The next morning, as soon as Emma left for school, I called Charles, my best friend, my voice filled with urgency. "Charles, I need your help," I said, my words tumbling out. I think something awful is happening to Emma at school. But she refuses to tell me. Her teacher, Mrs. Carter, there's something off about her. I know it. Charles was silent for a moment. Have you talked to her teacher? What does she say? I have, I replied, my frustration rising. But something's not right. I need to get to the bottom of this. I need to know what's happening to Emma. Charles hesitated before speaking again. What are you going to do? Daniel? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. I have to. The following days felt like an eternity. Emma's silence weighed heavily on me. And every time I looked at her, I saw the fear lurking in her eyes. The unspoken pain that she couldn't share. I couldn't just sit back and wait for her to open up. I needed answers, and the feeling of helplessness was slowly eating away at me. I decided that enough was enough. I knew I couldn't let Emma face whatever was happening alone. And I couldn't allow Mrs. Carter's cruelty to go unnoticed any longer. I had to find out the truth, no matter what it took. But how could I get to the bottom of this without putting Emma in more danger? The answer came to me one night as I watched her sleep. Her tiny form curled under the blanket. Still and fragile, I had to act covertly, without her knowing, so she wouldn't be even more terrified. I needed proof, something concrete that would expose the truth. The next morning, while Emma was still asleep, I quietly entered her room. In my hand was a small recording device. A piece of technology I had never imagined I'd use on my own child. I attached it carefully to her favorite sky blue hair clip, making sure it would stay hidden in her thick curls. The device was small but powerful, designed to record hours of sound. I hesitated, knowing that this was crossing a line I never thought I'd cross. But I had to do it. Emma was in danger, and I needed to know what was happening at that school. When Emma awoke, she didn't question me about the clip. She simply smiled and thanked me as I fixed her hair. But as she headed to school, that smile faded again. She didn't seem to be herself. Her usual sparkle was gone. I spent the rest of the day waiting, the hours dragging on as I checked my phone every few minutes, hoping for some sign, some small piece of evidence. Finally, when it was time to pick Emma up, I rushed to the school, my heart racing in my chest. When I saw her, I knew something was wrong. Her face was pale, her steps slow, and her eyes, those eyes that had once been filled with life and curiosity, were now clouded with something darker. She climbed into the car without saying a word, her gaze fixed on the window. Her small hands clutched tightly to the fabric of her skirt. Sweetheart, what happened today? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She turned her face slightly toward me, but didn't respond. The silence between us was unbearable. Emma, I said, my voice breaking, you can talk to me. I know something is wrong. Please, tell me. After a long moment, she finally whispered, you can't help me. Her words were barely more than a breath, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. The weight of her fear, the depth of her pain, was now something I could no longer ignore. What do you mean, Emma? I will help you. You're not alone, I pleaded, my voice trembling. But she just shook her head. The fear in her eyes too much for me to bear. I knew then that I had to act. And fast. I needed to know the truth. Not just for her, but for every child who might be suffering the same way. That night, after Emma fell asleep, I took the clip and connected it to my computer. My heart raced as I pressed play, the sound of the recording filling the room. At first, it was just the noise of students talking and the faint sound of pencils scratching paper. But then, I heard her voice, Mrs. Carter's voice, cold and harsh. Emma, stand up, she snapped, and I could hear the scrape of a chair as Emma obeyed. There was a tense silence. And then I heard it. A loud slap echoed through the speakers. My blood ran cold. Mrs. Carter's voice continued, her words cruel and cutting. You're useless. Just like your father. No one will ever love you. I sat frozen, my fists clenched tightly as I listened to the horror unfolding on the recording. I could barely hear Emma's soft sobs as Mrs. Carter's voice grew more menacing. If you tell anyone, I'll tell everyone that your father's a criminal. The police will come and take him away. You'll be sent to an orphanage. The words struck me like lightning. My heart shattered for my little girl. No child should ever have to hear those words, let alone live through them. The recording continued, but I couldn't bear to listen anymore. I stopped the playback, my hands shaking uncontrollably. A wave of fury crashed over me. This wasn't just abuse, it was an attack on Emma's very soul. Mrs. Carter had broken her, and I couldn't let it continue. I called Charles immediately. I have the proof, Charles. It's all on the recording. Mrs. Carter is abusing Emma, and I'm going to expose her, I said, my voice full of determination. Charles was silent for a moment before responding. I'll help you. We need to go to the press. This can't be allowed to continue. That was it. There was no turning back. I couldn't let Emma suffer in silence any longer. The truth would come out, no matter the cost. As the days went on, the truth about Mrs. Carter's abuse and the school's cover-up started to unravel. The article we published exposed the depth of the corruption, and the media caught on quickly. Parents who had once been silent found their voices, standing up for their children and demanding justice. The public outcry was immense, and the authorities had no choice but to act. Mrs. Carter was arrested, her actions laid bare for everyone to see. Principal Roberts was also removed from his position, his complicity in the abuse becoming undeniable. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of relief. Emma, though still recovering, no longer looked over her shoulder with fear. The nightmares that had haunted her were slowly fading, and she began to smile again, that spark of innocence returning to her eyes. In that moment, I realized the power of speaking out. I had fought not just for my daughter, but for every child whose voice had been silenced. The fight wasn't easy, but the outcome was worth every moment of pain and fear. Emma had learned that the truth, no matter how dark, would always find its way to the surface. And in the end, love and justice had triumphed over fear. I stood by my daughter, promising her every day that I would always protect her, no matter what. The journey had been long, but we had made it through. We had brought justice, and that was a victory for all. Thank you for following Emma's story. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more life stories that inspire and bring hope. We are grateful for your support, and we hope to see you in the next video.